Now, MPs are among those marking the 10th anniversary of a deadly attack on Parliament Hill and another one just days before in Quebec. Both attacks killed members of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Let us take the time to mourn Corporal Nathan Cirillo and Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent, and remember who they were. Proud, devoted, selfless, and brave patriots.
A moment of silence was held in the House of Commons. Corporal Nathan Cirillo was shot and killed.
At the very time that this was happening, they were debating an anti-terror bill as the terror attack occurred, which I always find to just be a hilarious fact to point out. Yeah, that entire thing was extremely sketch. The guy who did it, I think it was Michael Zehaf Bebo. I'm pretty sure that his father was some type of asset of like Western military. His mother worked for Canada Immigration, and it was all just extremely known to police as it happened when it happened. Just a lot of very strange things was connected to all of that. I wrote about it when it happened. That was all an extremely weird event. Right before, it's about a year before Trudeau got elected. And yeah, at the very moment that it happened, they were debating an anti-terror bill that would have also given CSIS the legal authority to do the thing that they needed to do to stop the attack from happening, which is like the classic like 9/11 thing too, where it's like the Patriot Act. If we had the Patriot Act, we would have stopped what happened. It was because of not having like the Patriot Act that what happened. Here we go. Official investigation finds RCMP missed several opportunities to prevent the Parliament Hill attack. An official investigation into the 2004 attack on Parliament Hill in Ottawa has found that the RCMP missed several opportunities to prevent it. The investigation revealed that the RCMP failed to share crucial intelligence with other agencies, did not adequately monitor the movement of the gunman, Michael Zehaf Bebo, despite being aware of his radicalization. The report has also criticized the RCMP's response during the attack, stating that the officers were not properly trained or equipped to handle such a situation. According to a CBC journalist, Canadian authorities had conducted an exercise within the last month, simulating a worst-case scenario that included an attack in Quebec and another city, followed by the return of foreign fighters from Syria. The authorities have accepted the report's recommendations and have committed to implementing changes to avoid similar lapses in the future. The Canadian authorities may have been surprised by the actual incidents, but not by the concept of them. Within the last month, we know that the CSIS, the RCMP, and the National Security Task Force ran a scenario that's akin to a war games exercise, if you will, where they actually imagine literally an attack, followed by an attack and another, followed by a tip that some foreign fighters are coming back from Syria. So they're imagining a worst-case scenario. We're seeing elements of that happening now. The latest report is yet another instance of the Canadian police and security apparatus failure to react appropriately when needed, demonstrating a clear behavior. It is alarming to see Canadian authorities were aware of potential risk and had even simulated similar worst-case scenarios. Despite this, they failed to take appropriate action in a timely manner to prevent the attack. This is something that I wrote probably when it happened. Ron Atke, a law professor specializing in national security law at Osgoode Hall at York University and the inaugural chair of the Security Intelligence Review Committee, emphasized the importance of prevention and security intelligence during an interview with Anna Maria Tremonti on CBC Radio. Atke questioned the efficiency of Canada's security intelligence services preventing incidents like the attack on Ottawa's Parliament Hill in 2014. Atke highlighted the need for increased cooperation between security agencies and the police to prevent such attacks, expressing concerns over CSIS' ability to gather and share relevant information with law enforcement. Quote, "Prevention is always better than after the event," he said. Tremonti brought up a proposed legislation that the government had been prepared to introduce at the time, which aimed to address some of the issues Atke mentioned. In response, Atke described the situation as, quote, very ironic, as the government was seeking to implement the very powers needed to prevent the acts they were trying to stop. This is the transcript from the full interview. Atke is a law professor at Osgoode University, where he teaches national security law. He also is the first chair of the Security Intelligence Review. I always think of the terms of trying to prevent something before it happens through good security intelligence. And the question that raised in my mind is our security agency working in cooperation with the police, had information about these individuals? Why didn't they prevent it? How did CSIS miss them? They are supposed to be the people who have all the information about people on watch lists, and taking into account certain things that can be passed on to the police to prevent it from occurring. Prevention is always better than after the event. Tremonti. Now, the legislation that the government had been posed to bring in yesterday, or at least introduce yesterday, would have done some of that. Would it have not? Atke. Yes. It's very ironic. They want to bring in the powers that are necessary. The very acts they're trying to prevent occurred. And there's so many other connections with the dude himself and how he tried to go to Libya, and apparently his father fought in the Libyan liberation force, to try to overthrow Gaddafi when all of this is happening. And that's where he was trying to go and then couldn't go. And then there's a whole other aspect of this story, which is, here's another thing that I wrote. Intelligence reveals that the suspects in the Montreal and Ottawa incidents were closely monitored by authorities, leading to the revocation of their passports within the last 18 months. The situation raises questions about potential complexities and incompetence and even cooperation among those responsible for national security. In the wake of the attack, Prime Minister Harper was expedited into the introduction of a new CSIS Act aimed at addressing these issues. Interestingly, the phrase incompetence and complacency were also used by a spokesperson from the Special Intelligence Review Committee during an interview with CBC's The Current following the attack. New anti-terror tracking measures addresses black hole and CSIS intelligence. Quote, we'll be taking additional steps in the coming days to strengthen our counter-terrorist measures, and we will not overreact, but it is also time that we stop underreacting to the great threats against us. Canadian Public Safety Minister Stephen Blaney. On October 16th, prior to the initial assault in southeast Montreal, a controversial proposal faced opposition from several members of Parliament and constitutional lawyers who were skeptical of its chances of passing. However, in light of recent events, the likelihood of the approval has significantly increased. Prime Minister Harper himself addressed the matter during his opening statements to the House of Commons on October 23rd, 2014. He said, quote, last week, our government proposed amendments to the legislation under which the Canadian Security Intelligence Service operates. And as Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, I've been saying that our laws and police powers need to be strengthened in the area of surveillance, attention, and arrest. They need to be much strengthened, and I assure you, Mr. Speaker, that work which is already underway will be expedited. The signs are clear, and history has shown us that similar events have unfolded both within and beyond our borders. This is not Harper talking. But yeah, the infamous Toronto 18 plot was successfully averted, but only due to the diligent effort of the RCMP, well-known undercover RCMP special agent who infiltrated the terrorist cell by posing as a recruiter. I probably should, new information has come to light since I wrote this, because this was a sting up. This is classic. The Toronto 18 was like Terror Factory sting up. Undercover RCMP special agent infiltrated the terrorist cell by posing as a recruiter for over a year and even operated a training facility in Orillia, Ontario. The plot was ultimately foiled when one of the recruits unknowingly reached out to another RCMP special agent who was masquerading as a Middle Eastern arms dealer in an attempt to purchase 3 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. This entire thing that happened, this was, I believe, 2006. It was completely a sting off from the very beginning. It wouldn't have happened if the RCMP didn't make it happen. It was a Mr. Big sting up. That's what it was. Yeah, I'm going to keep reading. So yeah, there's multiple layers because this is clearly something that is political. I don't think it's a coincidence that as they were talking about heightened security measures and an anti-terror bill, terrorism happened in the very place that they were talking about it, in the parliament. I think that's a fair enough assessment. That is probably not a coincidence how it happened. And I pointed to the Toronto 18 thing to show, that there's very much infrastructure to create these things. The political leverage has long been this driving force behind covert intelligence operations. And it's these clandestine activities that often operate on three distinct levels of plausible deniability. Each has this escalating degree of involvement from those orchestrating the events, right? The first one is the event occurred and those in power capitalized on it for political advantage, which is just complacency. The event was allowed to happen, providing the perfect opportunity to exploit it for political gain, incompetence, and complacency. And then the event was intentionally orchestrated with full knowledge of the potential political benefits, which is complacency, incompetence, but then also outright complicity, right? So only at the third level does the concept of a quote unquote conspiracy actually take place. Evidence already supports the existence of the first two levels in various cases. While there may be no direct conspiracy in the murky waters of this story here of the October 22nd, 2014 attacks, in many instances, the possibility of more than just competence or complacency cannot be entirely dismissed. In one such case, there's conflicting reports that were surrounding the actions of multiple gunmen in a police chase at the Rideau Center that included a supposed masked motorcyclist. And again, this is a pretty dated article, so I'm not going to assign my life to those reports. I would have to research it again to totally back that statement. But I do strongly remember hearing that was a thing that happened and people saw it. And that's why I put it in the article. But yeah, it's these types of discrepancies that raised many questions about the extent of police involvement, moving from mere complacency to potential complicity, right? There's further intrigue that comes from reports by non-Canadian media sources suggesting that the father of Michael Z. Half-Bibo, the perpetrator of the 2014 Parliament Hill shooting, was a Libyan rebel in 2011. The father of Ottawa shooter, quote, the father of Ottawa shooter Michael Z. Half-Bibo appears to have been a rebel fighter in Libya, according to a Canadian news report citing unnamed sources. And I will say that the people who reported that was Breitbart, and I have the link here, it's still, but this is something that I learned early on in this insanity. That is an association fallacy, because if you use that and you say, look, there's a connection to him and the Libyan Liberation Force trying to overthrow Gaddafi, and you use that Breitbart article as the source of your claim, it looks like you're using far-right talking points, right? But it's always, the truth will always come from the worst sources, especially when regarding things like this, right? So yeah, in 2011, the Libyan rebels received significant financial support from NATO, which included Canada as a member nation. And by tracing the flow of funds, you can see that the forces responsible for radicalizing these young individuals after being backed by NATO, these Libyan rebels proceeded to move on to Syria and Iraq, ultimately forming what is widely recognized as ISIS. And there was a Jordanian diplomat who was connected to Harper, who had ties to recruiting for ISIS. There was numerous ISIS recruiting cells within Edmonton. There was a CSIS thing where people were recruiting ISIS women to go into ISIS. And the guy was not actually a CSIS agent, but he was acting on behalf of CSIS as a cutout, which is this funny thing that people who say that didn't happen always point to. But yeah, because this happened before the whole ISIS thing, but in the lead up to it, very much the same type of thing, right? And at the end of the day, the connections are there. It's not watertight, you start to drift off into conspiracy. But this is Canadian politics under Harper in the post 9/11 era, that the violence of this time in both Montreal and Ottawa brought to light a complex covert intelligence operation, the potential at least of a complex covert intelligence operation, and the potential impact on politics. Canada was in the midst of working towards strengthening its counterterrorism measures, and it was vital for the Harper administration to maintain a balance between security and then also civil liberties. And so by having this justified attack, you know what I mean, this attack to justify the erosion of the civil liberties, it's a lot harder to say, no, you can't do this, when Nathan Cirillo was killed and the MPs or the guys stormed the parliament with a gun, the MPs were in danger. So yeah, it became a lot easier to pass these types of bills that were violating civil liberties after that. And so the connection between these events, global geopolitical politics, and the formation of extremist groups like ISIS, and then to go back even further, Al-Qaeda, underscores the importance of state transparency and accountability in the intelligence community, which Canada, 10 years later, we still have not done at all. And the Canadian government did not learn from this incident. They might have learned in an intelligence way, but it didn't learn as far as how do we prevent this type of stuff from happening. It did, for sending special forces guys and stuff like that to go work with highly radicalized white nationalists in Ukraine that are then going to come back here. We are just begging for another situation. The convoy was similar, but not to the extreme. Apparently not. I've heard stories that there was like security threat and something was happening underneath that didn't really get like the media attention that it probably should have. But I also don't know if that's true and if that might have just been fear mongering. But yeah, they never really addressed the root cause of this radicalization, both within their own security forces and then also within the general public, because I say that by they continue to recruit, whether for Islamic extremist groups or for white nationalist groups in Eastern Europe. So yeah, the appropriate oversight of these actions has never been established, but the appropriate oversight that the state needs, the intelligence apparatus needs to do these types of things was definitely given more legal justification after this. That's my rant there. There's another thing about the car. I don't know if I'm going to get into that, but I was always it always bothered me. So the assailant first targeted Cirillo, the Canadian soldier on ceremonial guard duty at the Canada National War Memorial. The violence then escalated when he stormed the Centre Block Parliament building where members of Parliament were attending caucus. As the nation reeled from this incident, investigations were underway on multiple fronts. The RCMP delved into the murder of Cirillo, while the OPP scrutinized the security response to the attack. Numerous media outlets diligently pieced together a comprehensive timeline of the events preceding Bibeau's actions, shedding light on his whereabouts and activities prior to executing the attacks. Amidst the details, one particular piece of information stands out, capturing significant attention. CBC News learned that Michael Zehab Bibeau, the man who attacked the Parliament Hill and killed a reservist on Wednesday, drove around for almost 24 hours with a piece of junk mail taped in the rearview window of his car in place of a real temporary license plate. A pressing question arises. How was a man able to drive a car without a license plate up to the Parliament building undetected? In nearly every major Canadian city, there are plate scanners in place. Attempting to drive even short distances without a license plate is likely to result in being stopped by the authorities. This incident and this discrepancy in the incident raises concerns about potential police incompetence in the nation's capital. A small piece of information has come to light. The driver, Zehab Bibeau, purchased the car in Ottawa, but was unable to obtain a license plate due to insufficient identification. He then drove to Montreal to visit a relative before returning to Ottawa, a roughly 2-hour journey each way. Depending on his exact destinations, this revelation only leads to further questions, particularly regarding the use of automated license plate recognition cameras. The OPP and numerous municipal police services have deployed these devices in major cities since basically the aftermath of 9/11. Even in smaller cities such as Sudbury, where I grew up, we're known to have these cameras. I specifically remember seeing them. You see them all the time in major cities. The ALPR cameras utilize plate recognition software, which capture images of license plates and scan them against a comprehensive database of plate numbers. If there are any discrepancies, the system alerts authorities. Most police communication centers are equipped with this technology. The widespread use of ALPR cameras came to the forefront during the Tim Bosma murder case. Bosma was a Southern Ontario man who went missing and then was later found dead after posting an online ad about a truck for sale. The OPP utilized the ALPR technology to track the vehicle involved in the case. Local police and the OPP monitor which vehicles have been in specific areas over a given time period. Vehicle registration agreements include consent to this surveillance, making it a standard aspect of police intelligence gathering. And then there's a quote, "The system will make it easier to identify expired validation tags, especially at night, and it could also serve as an investigation tool, allowing police, for example, to scan certain areas in search of a stolen vehicle or Amber Alert situation." Cities across the region, spanning from Niagara Falls to North Bay, have implemented the use of advanced surveillance devices in various locations. These devices are installed on police vehicles or are affixed to poles at busy intersections and have become integral parts of law enforcement strategies. While some individuals argue that the deployment of these devices is limited to manned police cruisers and the pole-mounted systems are merely the product of an American police state myth, recent investigations reveal that this assertion is unfounded. This is basically because I had an argument with someone who said that this wasn't a thing. A Niagara Falls Review article from February of 2014, special cameras are mounted onto police vehicles or on poles in certain areas of town that have the ability to scan about 3,000 license plates per hour. Authorities across Ontario have been utilizing advanced plate recognition technology for years, according to sources. Next time you find yourself in a major intersection, take a moment to look up. These cameras are strategically placed at various locations and are not just for surveillance. They are equipped with cutting-edge plate recognition systems. These devices work in conjunction with a scanning database, automating the process of collecting data and alerting law enforcement to act. The technology is particularly useful in identifying individuals with prior charges, those on bail or under house arrest, or among many other things. Contrary to popular belief, this technology is not a recent development. In fact, numerous law enforcement agencies, including the Ottawa Police, the OPP, the RCMP, have already adopted these systems. This is in 2014. These plates recognition cameras can be found all over the province, from Niagara Falls to North Bay, Ottawa to London, and are not limited to the Highway 407 corridor, as people may suggest. In recent years, numerous instances have emerged where law enforcement has successfully utilized pole camera technology to trace the whereabouts of vehicles connected to high-profile cases. Among these were the chilling Tim Bosma and Loretta Saunders murder investigations, which highlighted the increasing importance of this surveillance tool in modern crime-solving technology. Okay, so here's my conclusion. It is not difficult to deduce the effectiveness of this technology. Simply remove your vehicle's license plate and drive around town. It's likely that you'll be stopped very soon. It's that simple. Now, say if you were doing that in the nation's capital for 24 hours, like the news article reported. This man, Zihaf Bibo, who was reportedly well known to the police, even to CSIS, drove around between Ottawa and Montreal for 24 hours without being stopped, despite the presence of plate scanners throughout both major Canadian cities, including smaller ones at key intersections. These scanners are known to aid police communication centers in tracking individuals with higher charges or travel restrictions, such as probation or conditions of release. The fact that this individual managed to remain undetected for such an extended period of time in the capital, especially when police and intelligence agencies were on high alert and knew of this person, is baffling. It's always been baffling. It has always raised critical questions about how a radicalized individual known to authorities was able to evade detection, carrying out a significant terrorist attack on the capital of Canada. The incident sparks debate over whether the failure could be attributed to incompetence, complacency, or complicity within the intelligence and law enforcement community. This isn't even talk about the whole fake story about how he was killed and the sergeant of arms thing and how someone else basically killed him. And then it was attributed to the sergeant of arms, which I know from a firsthand source was like a fake story, that the sergeant of arms person didn't kill him. And like there was an entire like absurd, like James Bond-esque story where he was like hiding behind a pillar and then did the fucking like Matrix, like turn around and shot while he was in the air anyways, complete nonsense. It was like Capitol security, Parliament security, like some type of Parliament security officer who shot the guy. And then the sergeant of arms basically was the person who got like who they said that shot the guy. This is all allegedly, by the way. So yeah, in conclusion, it was these events on Parliament Hill in Ottawa on October 22nd, 2014, that exposed many gaps in Canada's security apparatus. The fact that Michael Z. Hefbibo managed to evade detection while driving without a proper license plate will always raise concerns and questions about the efficiency of the ALPR system and the competence of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. There's also the thing where some of the video that they have of him running towards the War Memorial was from a cop car dash cam. And it's like, if there's a cop car dash cam that has the video of the guy, don't you think there would also be cop car dash cam of the guy driving without a license plate? And don't you think that would have prompted the police to pull him the fuck over? I will say, just because I probably didn't know this when I wrote this article, but you don't need to have a license plate on the back of your vehicle in Quebec. But still, if you're doing that in Ottawa, in a time where there had already been a terrorist attack or like somebody drove, I can't remember the exact details, but I'm pretty sure there was like a car attack where somebody drove and ran over police officers just days before this. They were already on high alert with cars. And as time goes on, Canadians, especially people like myself, have always been left grappling with the unsettling notion that this attack was likely preventable. It was, again, based on incompetency, complacency at best, and complicity at absolute worst in the cynical framework of looking at it. In the worst case scenario, the intelligence apparatus was complicit in what happened here. Best case scenario, it was incompetency and complacency. But again, complacency always serves as cover for the complicity. So yes, obviously the people who mourn the loss of Nathan Cirillo, they want answers too. Obviously they want answers for different reasons, but I think that the questions about this were never fully answered because of just the climate at the time. It was still like in the Harper years during the wake of the anti-terror panic, essentially. This is now in the Obama years. They again started to do active recruiting for this type of the Mr. Big sting ops, or the terror factory thing, where you're just setting up people to do terrorism that you are planning, the FBI, and then similar like the Toronto 18 story I talked about. You set it up and then you just arrest them because That yes, it, yeah. Problem, action, solution.
Guarding the National War Memorial in 2014, the gunman then stormed and opened fire in center block before he was killed. The attack came 2 days after warrant officer Patrice Vincent died in a separate attack at Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu in Quebec.
So a day of unprecedented chaos in Ottawa with lots of questions.
I'll watch this quickly because I think it's interesting, and I wanted to see if it had the actual quote. Yeah.
To be answered. Joining us tonight, Ray Boisvert is the former assistant director of CSIS. He's in Las Vegas tonight. Amar Singham is an expert on foreign fighters and radicalization. He joins us from London, Ontario. And the CBC senior correspondent, Adrian Arsenault, is in Toronto tonight. Ray, let me begin with you. We're dealing with two people, both Monday and today. Monday in Quebec, today in...
How far Adrian came from just being that correspondent to making it all the way to the lead now, to be the anchor. Wonder what you got to do to get that spot, what work you have to do. I think that wasn't, I don't know exactly who it was, but she did, I'm pretty sure she covered stuff in Ukraine and also maybe in Afghanistan. I might be thinking somebody else. Anyways.
Now, Ottawa, who were being monitored by security forces, and yet this happens. How could it happen?
We have to look at these cases separately, though, in the sense that the first individual was probably looked at from a security or a national security perspective. Not so clear on the second case. We'll have to wait for some of the facts to emerge. Either way, Peter, it comes down to the same issue I've mentioned before. It comes down to the velocity of the issues, the volumes of them, and the lack quite often of specificity around individuals. So it leaves lots of gaps for security agencies.
When they say, as they did today, Ray, that they were surprised by what happened, does that surprise you that they were surprised?
Yeah, probably. It seems like this fellow had a very tortured past, one more towards criminal behavior versus one that I consider a national security concern. That transition point can be a very short timeline. And of course, that's the problem of the lone actor, suddenly making a plan. And I get a sense from today, it looks pretty improvised overall. But
See, I feel like everything they just said there is legitimate propaganda. The lone wolf thing always takes out every type of connection to any type of more sophisticated operation. And then also the other thing that he said was
point can be a very short timeline. Fellow had a very tortured past, one more towards...
Oh, they were surprised that they were surprised. He was known to police. Like, he was known to police. He was known to CSIS.
Criminal behavior versus one that I consider a national security concern. That transition point can be a very short timeline. And of course, that's the problem of the lone actor, suddenly making a plan. And I get a sense from today, it looks pretty improvised overall, but the consequences are tragic.
Adrian, you've been looking at this whole issue of radicalization in depth over the last year or so. You've dealt a lot with security officials, and you know how they have been preparing for these kind of situations. What can you tell us about that?
I can tell you that they may have been surprised by the actual incidents, but not by the concept of them. Within the last month, we know that CSIS, the RCMP, the National Security Task Force, all engaged in, I suppose, they ran a scenario that's akin to a war games exercise where they actually imagined literally an attack in Quebec, followed by an attack in another city, followed by a tip that, hey, some guys are coming back, some foreign fighters are coming back from Syria. So they were imagining a worst case scenario. We're seeing elements of that happening.
See, that is so spooky. Come on. Come on. The same exact thing happened
right now, but they were trying to figure out, in the event of that worst case scenario, how do we maintain the integrity of the investigation? Who's in charge? Who calls the shots? Who does what? Who calls whom? That is what they were trying.
That's how you're able to establish the line of command and those types of things, is because you don't have that established. You have now created, you've now established interference because you've created these alternative lines of communication. And this whole thing is just spooky as fuck. Always has been, always will be. I remember the day where I was when it happened. It was just those ones where it's, if you knew immediately, like it was just The whole thing was it was just bad. It was just a badly put together. I don't like to use the word false flag, but it was a intelligence failure. That it was a convenient intelligence failure. Let's call it.
Trying to do so. This people may talk today in terms of being surprised, but we know this precise scenario has been keeping them up at night for a while.
Amar, tell us something, if you can, about the kind of people who have been radicalized. What is their end game? What are they trying to accomplish here?
I think if some of the facts of the case are confirmed, such as them trying to leave the country to join ISIS.
It's so funny because when it was the last time that we heard that term, radicalized, it immediately shifted once it got to the Trump years. It just immediately shifted to domestic extremism, but like white extremism, not like domestic terrorism. The term radicalized, as far as Islamic extremism, just fell out of the discourse.
To fight in Iraq and Syria, and that they had their passports seized, we can probably infer a few other kinds of characteristics of what they believe and what they stand for. One is that they do believe in a kind of jihadist narrative of establishing the Islamic State, raising the banner of Islam around the world, and those kinds of things, which include the proper implementation of Sharia law as they see it, or the full moral weight of Islam as they see it in a particular state.
They needed to present this at the time to deflect, to use Islamic fundamentalism and all of that stuff to deflect from the legitimate grievances that the people from the Arab world would have been having at this point. Fucking Palestine. It was going on in Libya or Afghanistan still, Iraq as well. They just framed it as a question of Islamic fundamentalism and the extremism that's attached to it, and how it's attached to mental illness in the West with people who become radicalized. That whole pipeline that was constantly gestured towards doesn't get gestured towards anymore. I mean, they want to bring it back because it would work really well for their security apparatus to be able to use that narrative to dragnet a whole bunch of Palestinian resistance activists and things like that, to associate them with radicalized extremism, which, I mean, it's already happened. We already saw it happen. There was somebody who was arrested by the RCMP who was apparently like planning to do an attack in New York City on October 7th. So yeah, all of that stuff is still happening. It's just not a talking point like it used to be, because like the Trump era basically stole, the liberals and Democrats basically stole like that notion of the other that conservatives would do with like Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremists, and then applied it to the far right and to like domestic white extremism, white nationalists and things like that, which then made it so like that this is the other, this is the enemy, so we should do something about them. That's like the rallying cry. Like the Bush and Harper years, they used like Islamic fundamentalism and extremism and terrorism to rally the troops. And then eventually after Trump, we started to see, especially in Canada first, because there was a liberal government in power while Trump was in power. So we really started to see that externalization of white nationalist domestic extremism to then be used as that other that would then rally the troops. And that's what the convoy was. Similar type of thing, was like to externalize this opposition to then make the status quo more palatable because it's, at least you're not voting with the fascists. Yeah.
I should add that it's not mainstream Muslims who believe this. It is a kind of sectarian ideology within Islamic belief. The second thing we can infer is that there is the kind of revenge narrative associated with this, and this is very much tied to foreign policy and so on. I tracked a few of the Twitter responses shortly after the shootings in Ottawa, and it was all very much associated with Canadian foreign policy. What do you expect if Canada gets involved in the Middle East? What kinds of things are you expecting? And that kind of rhetoric. So I think if...
You mean reasonable, justified rhetoric like that? obviously not like, it's the same type of thing where it's, what do you expect? Do you think people that are having their like families and indigenous homeland ripped apart because of our foreign policy? What do you expect? And presenting that, I don't think that you could present that type of talking point anymore, because it's just become so apparent to the whole world that, yeah, it's the blowback. And to be honest, if it was just this, you know, I think the worst thing that happened after that was the van driver in Toronto. But that wasn't, that was just literally like an incel. Yeah, that was the Trudeau era of the terror factory. It pertained to those archetypes. Anyways.
The facts of, if some of the facts that are floating around about these two individuals are confirmed, then I think a few other things can be inferred as well.
All right, Adrian,
Trying to leave the country to join ISIS or join
people who have been radicalized. What is their end game? What are they
Sorry,
trying
I
to
just
accomplish?
he said people that want to join
I
ISIS.
think if some of the facts of the case are confirmed, such as them trying to leave the country to join ISIS or to fight in Iraq and Syria, and that they had their passports seized, we can probably infer a few other kinds of characteristics of what they believe and what they stand for. One is that they do believe in a kind of jihadist narrative of establishing the Islamic State, raising the banner of Islam around the world, and those kinds of things, which include the proper implementation of Sharia law as they see it, or the full moral weight of Islam as they see it in a particular state. I should add that it's not mainstream Muslims who believe this. It is a kind of sectarian ideology within Islamic belief. The second thing we can infer is that there is a kind of revenge narrative associated with this, and this is very much tied to foreign policy and so on. I tracked a few of the Twitter responses shortly after the shootings in Ottawa, and it was all very much the facts of a few other things can be inferred as well.
All right, Adrian, in terms of the monitoring of these people, we've heard up to 90 perhaps.
And then if some of the facts that are floating around about these two individuals are confirmed, then I think a few other things can be inferred as well.
All right, Adrian, in terms of the monitoring of these people, we've heard up to 90, perhaps a lot more, are being monitored by various security agencies. What's actually being accomplished in that monitoring, or is there something missing in terms of how this is unfolding?
There are a lot of facts that are missing at the moment in terms of this particular attack and what happened in Ottawa today. We've got a long way to go to know exactly to what degree he was on anyone's radar and whether they in fact did seize a passport, which is what we've been hearing about the 90 people who've had their passport seized. Like,
if they seized his passport, he was on their radar. It's that simple. They're contradicting themselves from the very beginning.
I can tell you that the RCMP don't like to do that. They will often tell you that if it's so bad that someone is so close to leaving this country to go fight, that all that's left to do is to bang on the door and take the passport, then that's a failure. It's a failure of policing. It's a failure of the community, of the family, to somehow with moral suasion get.
But you know what it is? It's a great way to get them to do something violent, right? Like, it's a great way, especially they're saying, though, they're monitoring all these different people. So we have all these different cells. If you take the idea of what they project as far as like terrorist cells and then just apply it to the police doing, it makes so much more sense, right? Because they obviously always admit that they're tracking different cells. And you're tracking them to be able to deploy them when needed, or to be able to let them do what they want to do, or stop them from doing what they want to do when it's politically needed, which, again, they were debating an anti-terror bill when the guy stormed the fucking parliament. That is a fact.
Get that person out of the radicalization tree, if you will. So when you take the passport away, you just trap that person, and they don't like it because they know that they haven't succeeded in getting rid of the extremist ideology. And so
It seems like they do like it because it's going to cause this.
suddenly you have someone who is angry that they've been stopped, humiliated that they've been stopped, still determined to do something. They're a bit of a ticking time bomb, and all you've done is take their passport away. When you hear that it's a tool in the box, it's not one they like.
Right. It sounds like they just basically explained what happened. Oh, like they knew he was a problem and they made it a bigger problem.
Hey, do you want to react to that?
Oh, absolutely. It's been one of the two really worst scenarios Adrian mentioned. First one being, of course, this idea that the lone shooter, very difficult to detect because quite often they plan in secrecy, obviously by themselves. It's similar to the Anders Breivik incident in Norway several years ago. Complex event.
There's so much sowing doubt, right? Like the lone wolf thing is always to suggest that a domestic attack, a domestic act is without any type of broader organizational support. And that's often emphasized by the media and security and intelligence agencies and the police for several reasons. A lot of the time it's to minimize systemic failures, like to frame an attack as the work of a lone individual allows intelligence and security agencies to downplay their own failures. If an attack is viewed as a large coordinated effort with multiple participants, it raises questions about how such a network could exist under the radar of these highly sophisticated surveillance systems that the police tell us about all the time. The lone wolf narrative shifts the accountability away from those lapses into just like a matter of chance. The other way is, as far as a public safety matter, is to prevent public panic, because it emphasizes the lone wolf theory helps control public fear, public angst, and prevents widespread panic about a larger coordinated terrorist threat, because too much fear with capitalism, and you end up getting people going to get toilet paper and masks and things like that, right? They don't want that. So it's this lever that you have to turn, but can't turn it too much or it just goes off the deep end and you've now fucked up with the economic relations of things. The lone wolf theory, or the lone wolf narrative, reassures the public that the event was isolated and reduces the anxiety about additional acts of violence from a broader group or network. Also, it's to avoid political fallout. Like if an attack like this is attributed to a lone individual, it's a lot easier for governments and law enforcement to avoid broader scrutiny of public or social conditions that may have been contributed to the rise of these extremist ideologies. It prevents uncomfortable discussions about systemic issues like the role of the state and social inequality, or law enforcement's ability to track these types of groups and these types of people. It also was a great way to say, oh, all of the pieces were there, but we just didn't have enough legislative ability to, like, legal oversight to be able to share the information through the channels that were needed to be able to do the things that were needed to prevent it. And again, they were literally debating a bill in Parliament about to create those channels of intelligence when he stormed the Parliament building. Another thing too is that, as I said, it legitimizes surveillance practices, because this lone wolf narrative then, because of that chance, that act of chance narrative, it justifies increasing surveillance and security measures to target these individuals. If it's single individuals, it seems more justifiable because you're just trying to weed out these single individuals rather than large scale domestic crackdowns. And by emphasizing that it's happening on an individual level, it rationalizes the expansion of intelligence gathering efforts into a micro level, because it's presenting this as any individual could be a potential threat, right? And the other way that this happens is that they frame it like the perpetrator was a lone wolf, because it helps depoliticize the attack, especially when the assailant's ideology aligns with movements that are it's two-pronged, actually. There's two different ways that they can do it. And I believe that at that time, it was being used in a way that wasn't speaking to the broader liberal population as far as grieved Arab extremism. Just to try to associate, yes, this is what it is, to try to associate legitimate grievances that people from the international Middle East, North Africa, Arab community would have about various different foreign policy things, and then saying that they did it because of that, and then associating like that legitimate grievance with now this violence, and then othering it to say not everyone thinks like that, and if you do, you're an extremist. And so it's this way to you see this similarly. They are putting the pieces together to do something similar with like how you see these like attacks on the fucking schools and stuff like that when no one's there and there's never any credible witnesses, and putting the pieces together to have it so then when something does happen, they can associate that thing that happened with Palestine resistance or many other types of legitimate grievances. And then that way, yeah, like anti-war, legitimately, like they did that in the U.S. in like the 70s, where they like tried to present like the anti-war movement as violent, which then associated anti-war prerogatives with violence, which then discredited them. So, yeah. Anyways, I'm going to wrap this up.
Involving lots of moving parts, but did it all himself. So that's been the worst thing, especially for those who are responsible for guarding very public places, and especially the most significant iconic places such as Parliament, a large, complex security piece. How do you keep it open but keep it secure? The second part, of course, is exactly that. We developed a doctrine. I worked at CSIS some years ago. These were our issues involving our people. They are Canadians. They must remain here, as opposed to exporting terror.
Then you're just... Two things that he said here. The thing about having these large buildings, these large complexes that you need to keep open, but you need to keep them safe. What he's talking about there is to profile every single person that goes in there, have ID badges, and then you're able to create this techno profile. I forget what the word is, but it's a part of having a data print that your behavior is then understood by the algorithm. And this really emerged during the late aughts, the technological boom in the wake of the war on terror, where it was setting up all of the things to create the algorithm, which is what it is now, where they can track your behavior based on your purchases and things like that. You know, if somebody buys something that they think might be in connection to some type of violent act, the police or the intelligence agency then says, okay, what do we think they're doing? Is this going to be something that benefits or not? And I know that this sounds crazy, but it's not. It's really not. Because that's what the state has a monopoly on violence means. That's what it means. It's, like I said, it's either incompetence, complacency, complicity, when the holy trinity of the police psyop is put together. The incompetence and the complacency serves as the cover for the complicity, which I went over at the beginning. So yeah, this is a pilled stream.
Well, once you are successful in doing that, then you have a different set of issues. And then how do you monitor all those individuals as the numbers of targets and numbers of would-be, and especially when it comes to converts to religion, because sometimes they're even more obsessed with showing themselves to be true believers. It's very difficult. It becomes a numbers game.
That one he's talking about the Victoria Parliament building bombings on Canada Day, which it wasn't a bombing. They put pipe bombs on the lawn and then he got arrested immediately. That guy was like a white guy who I think got converted to Islam, like through the handler that set him up. That was like a intelligence ask or like RCMP. The whole thing was just a scam that had, they were drug addicts. Him and his girlfriend got ensnared in this police operation. There's a CBC podcast about it that I never listened to, but I know that is probably pretty good. But I think it's called Pipe Bomb, but it talks about that entire thing. It was a Mr. Big sting. I'm pretty sure the defense argued and got like reduced sentence because they said it was purely a sting. It wouldn't have happened if the police didn't put him up to it.
And it becomes this issue of the art of intelligence work versus the science. When do you know that there's a radicalization thing happening? When are they going to turn that to action? One thing I will add, though, is that we need to...
See, he just said what I said. right? Now think of it in the opposite of, instead of preventing it, thinking of it, if you can do that to prevent it, you can obviously do it to make it happen too, or to allow it to happen.
Radicalization thing happening, one of the very, very difficult. It becomes a numbers game, and it becomes this issue of art, the art of intelligence work versus the science. When do you know that there's a radicalization thing happening? When are they going to turn that to action? One thing I will add, though, is that we need.
I'm pretty sure you almost just Freudian slip dark arts, which maybe I'm pilled, but that was, I don't know, maybe, but it is dark arts. Like what they're talking about is like some old school way of maintaining a monopoly on violence. Sometimes you got to do, spooky shit. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes you don't because you have the technology, or you don't need to do all this spooky shit. But the way they did it back in the day, that like if you look up the term assassin, where that comes from, they mind controlled people to make them into assassins, where they thought like God made them do it. Again, this is all very insane. I've got completely off the rails on this stream, but that's what we're here for.
To get at those who are the purveyors of hate. So those who prophesize and those who are radicalizing, we need to find ways to go after them with respect to hate speech, or perhaps it's time for new legislation under the Anti-Terrorism Act, as we're seeing in the UK.
All right, I've only got 30 seconds left, so Amar, if you can close this out for us. What should we expect now? If everybody seems to agree this was a turning point today, this week has been a turning point, what should we expect next?
I think we have to be careful about how we react to events like this, because the Muslim community in Canada and around the world already feel stigmatized and securitized in many ways, and they are stigmatized and securitized in many ways. So events like this can make things much worse and actually can till the soil on which radicalization actually occurs. So then we do have to...
Again, what if you want that to happen, right? Because time showed that's exactly what ended up happening. There was a trickle effect that was happening through all the early 2010s Harper era. The terror factory was in full force. And to
be careful about how we react as a society to events like these, and see them in their proper context, and see the jihadist narrative or other kinds of radicalization in their proper context, and not generalize to the community as a whole.
Okay. I appreciate listening to all your thoughts on this. It's a difficult subject, especially on a day like Amar Singham, Adrian Arsenault, Ray Boisvert. I appreciate your time.
I'm glad that I was able to get the actual Adrian Arsenault quote, because I didn't want to quote something that was not attributed to her. So I'm glad that I found it. I'm glad that I got to speak on this, because I thought that it was worth talking about. While they actually are playing legitimate commercials,